Epic just laid off 1,000 people. That's 20% of the company, and a $500 million cost cut. But here's the part that doesn't make sense. Fortnite didn't fail. It's still one of the biggest games in the world. So why does a company at the center of gaming suddenly need to shrink? Because nothing actually broke. Fortnite is still massive, millions of players, constant updates, still one of the most dominant games in the world, which is exactly why this doesn't make sense. Companies don't cut this aggressively when things are working. So if nothing collapsed, what actually changed? A few years ago, Epic was operating from a position most companies never reach. Fortnite wasn't just a successful game. It functioned like a self-feeding ecosystem. Content drove engagement, engagement drove spending, and that spending funded an almost endless expansion. That momentum didn't stay confined to the Battle Royale. Investment expanded outward into Unreal Engine, the Epic Game Store, and massive legal battles meant to reshape how global platforms handle revenue. All of that relies on one core truth staying constant: the engine needs to keep compounding. For a long time it did, but then the pace started to shift. Not overnight, but steadily. Fortnite playtime dropped significantly over the past year, down to around 6.65 billion hours. Average time per player began to soften across major platforms. According to Circana's player engagement tracker, on PlayStation, the average player spent 16 hours in Fortnite in February 2026, down from 21 hours the year before. On Xbox, it dropped from 19 hours to 15 hours. Not a collapse, but a clear signal that engagement is no longer compounding the way it used to, and this is where it starts to matter. In a live service system, trajectory matters more than scale. Efforts to expand the experience were clearly on the table. New modes like Rocket Racing and Festival pushed beyond the traditional loop. The intention was obvious: broaden the ecosystem and give players new reasons to stick around. Some of those ideas landed briefly. Very few held long enough to actually move the needle on overall engagement. Even with creator-made islands expanding through UEFN, most of the engagement still clusters around what Epic builds and promotes directly. So the surface kept evolving, but the underlying behavior didn't. And that gap between what was being built and what players actually stuck with, that's where the problem is. At the same time, player attention has been drifting. More time is moving toward environments that offer flexibility and creation, rather than purely developer-led experiences. According to Newzoo, the Battle Royale genre saw a 27% decline in playtime in 2025. While Sandbox experiences surged by 36%, Roblox is the clearest example of this shift, where content is entirely driven by creators. Fortnite is moving in that direction with UEFN and player-created islands, but it hasn't fully reached that level of creator-driven engagement yet. Content still leans heavily on what Epic builds and promotes at scale. And that difference matters, because Fortnite is evolving into a platform. But it hasn't fully escaped being a game yet. Now layer that against how Epic is built. The company scaled around growth, teams expanded, investments increased, and long-term bets were placed across multiple fronts. Legal battles alone have already cost Epic hundreds of millions, based on court disclosures and industry estimates. The store kept expanding, creator payouts increased, infrastructure kept scaling. All of this assumes one thing: that the core ecosystem keeps carrying more weight over time. And this is the real issue. Fortnite didn't collapse. It just stopped growing in a way that everything around it depends on. You can see that pressure showing up in smaller decisions. Pricing changes, for example, triggered immediate backlash. Not because of the increase itself, but because of when it happened. When engagement softens, tolerance drops with it. That's when friction becomes visible. Eventually, that pressure has to resolve. In this case, it led to layoffs, contractor reductions, and a broader reset in how resources are allocated. But the more important change here is structural. More responsibility shifts outward. Game modes move into UEFN. Creators take on a larger role in sustaining the ecosystem. Epic has already started pulling back from internally built modes. Experiences like Ballistic, Rocket Racing, and Festival Battle Stage are being sunset. But instead of disappearing, the systems behind them are being pushed into UEFN, handed over to creators to iterate, expand, and sustain. And now, that shift is being reinforced economically. Creators can monetize directly inside their own islands. Selling items, progression systems, even gameplay advantages. With Epic offering 100% of V-Bucks revenue initially, before shifting to a 50% share model. At the same time, the engagement system is being reweighted. A significant portion of Fortnite's revenue, including sponsorships, is being funneled into creator payouts. And more importantly, creators are now directly rewarded for bringing in new players or reactivating churned ones, turning user acquisition itself into a creator-driven function. The model starts to rely less on centralized output and more on distributed creation. Something Epic is no longer experimenting with, but actively building toward. That's not a small adjustment. It's a transition from running a game to running a platform powered increasingly by creators. Fortnite becomes the entry layer, Unreal becomes the foundation, and the value shifts away from a single product toward the system built around it. That shift is already starting to take shape. Epic is opening Fortnite beyond its own engine. In November 2025, during Unite, Epic announced a partnership with Unity, allowing developers to bring Unity-built experiences directly into Fortnite, plugging into its discovery system and its creator economy. At the same time, commerce systems are becoming more flexible, expanding beyond Unreal's native stack. This isn't just an engine strategy, it's an ecosystem strategy. Fortnite stops being just a destination and starts becoming a distribution layer for experiences built anywhere. This isn't happening in isolation. Across the industry, live service shooters are becoming harder to sustain. Battlefield launched strong, starting with over 300,000 players on average each day. But within months, that number dropped to under 40,000. Even with new modes like Red Sec, engagement didn't hold. X-Defiant followed a similar path. Strong entry, but unable to sustain a live service audience, shutting down within a year. And this is the pattern: rising development costs, while engagement and revenue per player become harder to maintain, especially in the shooter category, where competition is constant and player expectations never stop increasing. And the cost isn't abstract. It shows up in jobs, in teams being reduced, in people who built these systems suddenly finding themselves outside of them. Epic will likely navigate this, but this moment isn't about survival, it's about signal, because this isn't a collapse, it's a slowdown. And in a system built on constant growth, a slowdown changes everything. The live service model is no longer scaling the way the industry expected, and that shift is already forcing a transition from running a game to running a platform.